Welcome to an introduction to biodiversity. So here you can see the opening slide, which is showing you the diversity as imagined as an image for all the planet. What we're going to do now is move forward and take a look at the first slide, which is a large overview of species diversity, habitat diversity, and genetic diversity. Remember that genetic diversity underlies everything else. Habitat diversity allows you to have more niches, and then the more species you have can also increase more habitat diversity. And then finally, both those two factors working together will then increase genetic diversity. And there's a wider range of varied characteristics caused by genetic diversity within a species and maintained within a diverse ecosystem. Now, the significant idea here is that the ability to both understand and quantify biodiversity is important to conservation efforts. And as you can see in the world here, you can see areas where there's high and medium impacts, areas of low impact, and you can see in the 1700s, most of the planet had low impact, whereas by 2050, you can see a corresponding difference in the sense that there's going to be a much larger impact in areas where there's large population and large resource exploitation. Now, in terms of biodiversity, it's a broad concept encompassing the total diversity in a living system, but you also have to think that it includes the species, the habitat diversity, and the genetic diversity, and then within that concept, there's richness, which is the number of different species living in an area, and the species evenness. And if you look at the picture to the right, you have the same number of species in each ecosystem. However, the evenness is not the same, and you can see the one tree that's at 70% in Community 2 is only at 25% in the other, and therefore Community 2 will have a lower diversity than Community 1. In terms of biodiversity, we have genetic diversity, and that's the different types of genes within a species. The larger the population, the greater the genetic diversity. The greater the genetic diversity, thus the greater variation within the species, and as we learned last week, the greater the variation, the better the chance for adaptability and survivorship. In terms of biodiversity and species, the number of different species in an ecosystem and their relative abundance and distribution is important. In other words, it's a measure of how many species there are, the number of organisms of each species, and how they are spread out through the ecosystem. And Simpson's Diversity Index, which we've looked at, is a good indicator of species diversity within an ecosystem. And here we see four pictures, A, B, C, and D, and as you look at them, you can see that A and B have a lower diversity than ecosystem C and D. D, looking from just at the top, having the most diversity because it's got the most niches, the most habitats available. Thus, the more niches, there's more different types of organisms, such as plants, to provide habitats and food. And overall, you're going to have a greater diversity of both species, habitats, and genetics. Species diversity, we're continuing to look at this. Oh, that's a mistake. Move forward. Now, in terms of how the diversity changes over time, you can have both over years of change as communities change. You can also have changes throughout a season, and we see that in Nova Scotia right now as the geese are leaving to find a different habitat. Now, we see what could be the Lamar Valley, where we have the wolves up in J, we have the grizzly bears in K, you have the wolves chasing the deer or the elk away in H, you have G with the browse going on, and what you can see here is that the habitat diversity refers to the range of different habitats in the ecosystem or biome. And you can note the varied habitats in this river valley create ecological niches to be filled by diverse life. Thus, there's more diversity. And again, this matches the wolves are back story that we read a while ago. Now, how does genetic diversity arise? And you can see here that we've got variation within a population. It's a good thing. It increases the odds that some individuals in a population will survive changing environmental factors. Now imagine that the background color changes from white to another color. In this case, the red butterflies will have a competitive advantage as predators will not be able to see them as easily. If the habitat was instead blue, then the blue organisms would have a competitive advantage, and thus they would survive better and pass on their genes. Now, when we look at the world, it's important to know the quantification of biodiversity, so the numbers, the evenness, the richness, is important to conservation efforts so that areas of high diversity may be identified, explored, and appropriate conservation put in place where possible. And you can see here in the world where the biodiversity hotspots are. That's areas that have unique species and also have high varieties of species. Here we can see an example of Singapore. The blue represents a species that they've imagined have gone extinct in Singapore that may have existed. The green is definitely extinct, and we can see there's a high level of extinction for species, especially as Singapore went from the green color in 1819 to Singapore of 1990, where we have a population of over 4 million, whereas in the 1700s there were just a couple hundred villages. That also corresponds similarly to the projected extinction in South Asia. The red is the worst case predictions, the yellow is the better case situation. Now, how do genetic diversity and habitat diversity contribute to overall biodiversity in ecosystems? Well, you can see there's relative values for biodiversity data. Data can describe patterns. Understanding the patterns and what's going on helps in our decision making. Quality data usually means better decisions. The more we know about something, the better assessments we can make. Now, unreliable data leads to poorly informed decisions. Now, in terms of the nature of biological communities and the conservation of biodiversity, one, how do we understand ecosystems? And this is a TOK link. We observe and measure them, and there's often issues in how you observe and how we measure, but through the discussion we can have a better understanding of what we're doing. Scientific observation is a search for patterns. Measurements will mean numbers. Numbers will mean quantitative data. That might mean a Simpson's diversity index. Patterns will tell us ecosystems' current state, the baseline. They will and how they were in the past, so that we can more accurately model their possible futures. And this will be involved in an environmental impact assessment. And we can use these models to examine and select our conservation options, just as we may be doing in Nova Scotia, where they're closing down a lobster fishery in order to protect right whales. Finally, this is the theory of knowledge link. The term biodiversity has replaced the term nature in much literature. And does this represent a paradigm shift? And that's something to consider. That's the presentation. Thank you.